decade or so, I have traveled around the world studying the worst people in power. And one of the things that's been a peculiar experience for me that spurred me to write this book was that I would go and I would interview somebody, a war criminal, a former despot, somebody who was awful in a faraway country. And I'd come back and I would talk to my friends or family members, and they would say, you know, that's just like my homeowners association tyrant, or that's just like the guy in mid-level management in my company. And so what I tried to figure out in this book and what spurred the research was, you know, is there a commonality here? Do we have a universal human trait of corruptible people seeking power, or does power universally turn people corrupt? Because the remedy to those two diagnoses is quite different. And then there's a third dimension that I focus on extensively in the book, which is, let's imagine that it is true that corruptible people seek power more than the rest of us, and that power corrupts, both of which, by the way, are true. How do we re-engineer society and redesign systems to make sure that incorruptible people seek and obtain power, and that power actually doesn't corrupt people, but it purifies them? And so that's the mandate for the book. It's trying to figure out how we can engineer a better world by navigating this extremely complicated world of power and systems to get better outcomes. And I think it's so interesting to have done this research because it applies in every realm of human society, from the homeowners association tyrant all the way up to the former despots that started my work. Yeah, you know, when you look back in history and you try to think about the grand sweep of history, we have all these awful people who crop up in history books. And we just sort of figure that that's the fate of our past selves. But this moment right now feels like a hopeful moment in which we have the technology, the tools, the wherewithal to try to create a better world. And we've seen this happening in all sorts of realms of human society: technological advancement to deal with problems like child mortality, you know, better adaptations to all sorts of environmental problems. And yet, when we ask about power, pretty much everybody I talk to is still disappointed when they look up in society. They say things like, when I look around to the people I know, they're good and decent people, and yet the headlines are dominated by abuse of power, with awful people wielding power unjustly. And so what I tried to do was to synthesize lots of different realms of human knowledge, everything from evolutionary biology, psychology, political science, behavioral economics, neuroscience, to try to understand what's actually happening. And I think that's the thing that has been a stumbling block for so long, is that we've all dealt with this in these little silos. The political scientists focus on one aspect, the evolutionary biologists focus on another, the anthropologists on a different one. And I think we're all ultimately tinkering around this big question, which is, you know, who does get power? How does it change us? And how can we get better people into power? And I think the ultimate moment for that is right now, when everything is changing. I mean, the pace of human adaptation to societal change has never been faster. And so I think right now, in this sort of turning point in history that we find ourselves in, post-pandemic, after the rise of populism, all sorts of upheavals in society, this is the moment to try to think back to the past of history and think, can we actually engineer a better future? There's two things that really stood out to me when it comes to the big surprises. The first thing that I find fascinating is this idea of how and why we select certain leaders. And one of the most interesting studies that's been replicated, it's been vetted, it's been published in top scientific journals, is a study in which children were shown two pictures of faces, and they were told to choose someone to be the captain of their imaginary ship in this computer simulation. They were given no other information. And what was amazing was that the children didn't realize that one of the faces was the winner of a French election, and one of the faces was a loser, a runner-up in that election. And yet the children, like clockwork, the overwhelming majority of the time, picked the winner to captain their ship, even though they had no idea the context of the face. And so one of the things that I think is fascinating, drawing on neuroscience, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, and psychology itself, is that leadership selection is far less rational than we think it is, and understanding those cognitive biases that go into it are crucial to counteracting them and getting better rational choices into determining who leads society. The second one that I wanted to focus on, that I found absolutely mind-blowing, was how power physically changes not just your psyche, but actually physically changes your mind. And I looked into a few different realms of this. One is with non-human primates, which, animal research crops up a few times in the book. But when you look at baboons, for example, you can find that there's actually significantly higher levels of stress and therefore genetic aging that's happening the lower down the hierarchy you go. The stressed, low-ranking baboons age faster, and it gets better as you rise the ranks until you get to the alpha male baboon, at which there's a target on their back. They're constantly stressed and they age really fast. And the lesson here, which applies to human society, is that it's good to be in the court, but perhaps not good to be the king. And we have studies that show this in CEOs and in presidents. In CEOs, we use machine learning to show that aging happens faster in faces for those who captain industries during times of particular distress for their industry. And for presidents, there's a study, an amazing study, that looks at 200 years, 17 countries, and finds that the loser of presidential elections lives 4.4 years on average longer than the winner of presidential elections. So it's a bit of consolation for those who lose. Perhaps they die a bit slower than those who beat them in the election. One of the things that's really jarring to me is that so much of corporate surveillance of employees involves low-ranking figures in the company who simply don't have the capacity to bring the company down. And when you think about all the corporate scandals of the last several decades, they're usually happening behind closed doors. And yet what's happening in the post-pandemic world of working from home and all the adaptations with technology is increasingly the ordinary employees are being watched in ways that often border on the dystopian. There are even devices that have weight sensors in chairs and webcams that are constantly monitoring whether you're taking an extra 5 minutes for your coffee break. And what I argue is that when you think about systemic risk to a company, to an organization, it's usually people who operate in corner offices behind closed doors that can do the most damage if they are not subject to proper oversight. Now, the balance here, of course, is to avoid creating a different dystopian society in which everybody is constantly fearing the omniscient oversight of some unseen oversight being that's watching them all the time and that they can't escape from. And so, to my mind, you have to be careful about how you calibrate oversight, but that the gaze should look up rather than down, because the lesson of corporate malfeasance and abuse and embezzlement is that typically those who are most watched in corporate societies are least prone to actually doing the kinds of catastrophic damage that most companies are most worried about. I think you have to calibrate very carefully when it comes to surveillance, because the problem is that you don't want to be watched all the time. People need to be creative. They need to toss around ideas that aren't ready for prime time. They don't want to be constantly recorded. The principle that I'm advocating for is this idea that if you are going to have some level of oversight, audits, actual checks, they don't need to be constant. They just need to be more gazing upward. They need to be more tailored towards the people who can actually ruin the company, the people who actually have access to embezzling millions or billions instead of the people who might steal a paperclip. And so I think there needs to be a recalibration of the sort of efforts of surveillance in a way that can provide oversight without having a dystopia emerge in the workplace where everybody is constantly being filmed or monitored 100% of the time. Randomization is a really powerful tool that isn't used enough, in my opinion. So one of the people I spoke to in researching the book was the former head of internal affairs of the New York Police Department, the NYPD. And what he said to me is that he pioneered this method called randomized integrity testing, in which a police officer would go into a supposed crime scene, and they would say there would be something like $20,000 in cash on the table and a bunch of drugs. And what the officer wouldn't know is that the whole apartment was wired with cameras and microphones. And if they pocketed the cash, let's say they took 6,000 and left 14,000 to report, that they would be arrested or fired from their job. Now, the beautiful thing about this was that the NYPD did 500 of these tests. But when they surveyed the police officers, 12,000 police officers said, yes, indeed, I was subjected to randomized integrity testing. So there were 11,500 times where a cop encountered a real crime scene and thought that it was fake and staged. And so they started behaving better. And the rest of the force also feared that they could be stung. So with a really small amount of these random tests, only angled at the people who are in positions where they can abuse their authority the most. Again, you don't want to have a dystopian world in which the break room fridge is baited and filmed and so on. But you have, if you tailor it appropriately, this small number of randomized tests can actually create a really powerful deterrent effect where those in positions of authority will think twice before engaging in abuse or deceit or embezzlement. And I think this idea of just making people fear a little bit the idea that they might face consequences if they engage in some truly malicious behavior in the workplace can pay huge dividends with a very small number due to the power of randomness. In Sweden, they have this system in which basically you have both the carrot and the stick when it comes to speeding. And I think it provides some lessons for business too. So if you speed and you get caught, you have to pay a fine. But the fine doesn't go to the government. It goes to people who are obeying the speed limits. And I think one of the things that we often don't do enough is incentivizing good behavior rather than just punishing bad behavior. Now, the other thing that's important to take away from some of these examples is that they're not rocket science, right? Sweden didn't come up with some ingenious idea. They just tweaked the system in a small way, and it started to pay significant dividends. So my hope in writing this book is that some very powerful people who are very well intentioned start to think more critically about the systems that are currently on autopilot in their organization, whether it's a business or a police department or whatever it is, and they start to think we could do it slightly differently, but it would pay huge dividends. And that's the sort of aspect where looking to these small examples can really add up to quite a lot of profound changes in making the world just that bit better. In the book, I provide 10 principles that I think can weed out the corruptible people who seek power and also attract more incorruptible people into power. Now, I'm not naive. I think my research has clearly shown me that bad, abusive people are disproportionately likely to seek power, disproportionately good at getting it, and likely to become worse once they wield it because power does indeed corrupt. So why am I not pessimistic? The reason I'm not pessimistic is because I think there are actually quite a lot of easy fixes to this. I don't mean that they're easy in the sense of actually implementing them immediately and having them pay off like a silver bullet. I mean that we have to think carefully about redesigning systems. And if we do that, I actually think we can fix this problem. We have designed, for example, in ways that we promote people or in ways that we hire people, a system that caters, frankly, to extroverted, narcissistic, Machiavellian psychopaths. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the systems that are used to vet people or promote them or hire them in the first place involve performances, short-term performances in which superficial charm, the two words that are most associated with psychopaths or narcissists, are on display. And so, just take one quick fix. At the University College London, where I teach, all of the grading that I do is fully anonymized. I grade a number, not a name. It's a really small change, but it makes it so I can't punish a student that I dislike, and I have no idea who I'm actually grading. And so I think the book is trying to say we need to think a little bit more creatively. We don't need to reinvent the wheel completely. We just need to think a little bit more creatively about how we design systems that would make it less attractive for psychopathic, abusive Machiavellians to join the organization, a little more attractive for good, decent, normal people to try to rise through the ranks, and actually make the pinnacle of power attractive to those people who might not want power for power's sake. Because right now we have quite a self-selection problem where the worst among us gravitate towards the top. Where I say we have these human tendencies, we have some broken systems, but they're fixable, and the ultimate outcome can be a much more just and incorruptible world. And that's my hope for what the book achieves over the longer run with some very smart people re-engineering the organizations that they inhabit and run.